in a world where time is a finite resource and I'm constantly emotionally burdened by the political and social state of the world, and I'm emotionally targeted by it, I think it's the most rational and efficient approach to further in a world where we can actually base or approach relationship based on practical value, right? And practicality in itself. Firstly, I'm going to just define quickly on what do we mean by practicality in the scope of this argument, right? Understand how this practicality approach actually works. Firstly, we think we just look at the metrics when we pursue a relationship. It can be all relationship. The scope of the debate applies to all relationship. A, family, B, friendships, thirdly, romantic, but fourthly, also career and communal relationships as a begin, right? But what do the metrics actually look like? It looks like, one, how it benefits you directly as an individual, but two, it also looks like things like convenience, right? How it's the most convenient relationship to go to, or if a relationship is inconvenient, then you just don't approach or pursue that relationship to begin with, right? There are a few standards that we think individuals will apply blanketly in practicality when they approach, but also in more individual level, it's going to differ individual to individual, but these are the metrics that individuals are probably going to use, right? It looks like one, it looks like familiar standards, like what kind of family you were born up with, right? So that you're going to consider that when you approach a relationship. Two, it looks like the societal standard, where what kind of society you have approached with and how it's going to affect when you approach relationships, right? Thirdly, it looks like religion. Fourthly, it looks like value. Fifthly, things like altruism and kindness, values that you were instilled with as growing as a child. Fourthly, a more practical, more values like financial and how emotional standards are also going to be applied. In the same, for example, just a quick metaphor is that if you are in an emotionally abusive relationship and it's just inconvenient for you to be in that relationship, regardless of the fact that you probably have practical benefits, it's just inconvenient, which means it's not practical to be in that relationship, you're going to probably opt out of that relationship, right? It looks like these logical and rational values you're going to combine with your own values, and you're going to assess every step of the way or consciously as to how it benefits you, right? But it also means that individuals are more communicative and transparent about what are the expectations that they have from a relationship. Because when you approach a relationship, you do a pro-con list from the top of my head about how it's going to affect you, which means that you're going to then, in the second step, communicate with the other person that this is the expectations that you have from a relationship. And it's a world where everyone's doing it based on practicality, which means that expectations are also going to come in from the other sides as well, right? But thirdly, it just looks like that you're going to prioritize your practicality. It's not to say that emotional relationships wouldn't exist. I think it's just unfair or uncharitable to say that emotional relationship wouldn't exist, but it's going to be likely overshadowed by tangible and practical benefits, right? If an emotion is inconvenient for you to pursue, you're going to probably not pursue it anymore. But an emotion is the most practical thing for you to pursue, you're probably going to pursue that practical approach to that emotional relationship as well, right? And as I said, it's going to apply. So my first argument is how it's the most efficient, rational approach that leads to reduced emotional conflict. Before that, your view.
Is practicality dynamic on it, and that is the same determination you enter in a relationship and stay in?
Yeah, when you enter into a relationship, you think of the practical approaches. By the time relationship approaches or like further goes on the line, if it's impractical for you to persist or retain that relationship, you're probably going to opt out of that relationship because it doesn't give you that practical benefit to live in. But it's also looking back at things, right? For example, if I'm in a relationship for 10 years and out of the 10 years, it's only the 2 years that it was impractical, but for 8 years has been the practical relationship, people are still going to pursue things like relationship counseling to get back that practicality to begin with. I don't think people are going to be like that irrational that they're just going to snap out of a relationship the moment one inconvenience happens. It also looks like how you weigh out a relationship, right? Like you think of the practical benefits, even if in an emotional relationship, you think of the emotional weighing and whatnot. So probably that kind of rational calculus is going to happen in an individual's head regardless, right? What do I mean by efficient and rational idea? The way it looks like is that when you approach a relationship, you do a clear cause-benefit analysis of what the relationship looks like, what you want from the relationship, and what you expect from the relationship as it grows and progresses. It also applies to things like family, friends, and relationships like romantic relationships and career. What do you mean by family? It looks like how you want financial benefits from your parents. It's clear-cut and communicated, and you want that. It probably looks the same from your parents, that where they want some sort of financial benefits from you. It's clear-cut and communicated to the child to begin with, right? It also probably looks looks like when you go into a friendship relationship, you tell them that the reason I'm friends with you, or the reason I want to pursue this friendship, is because I want to personally grow as an individual. That personal growth is also a practical benefit people are derived from relationships, right? Which means that if I'm friends with Hazim, for example, I can become a better student. I'm gonna pursue that relationships, right? I'm gonna pursue that relationship on the basis of that. That is the kind of mental calculus individuals are gonna make. It is the most rational approach that individuals will take, which is to say it's going to lead to reduce emotional conflict. How does that actually happen? In the status quo, the reason why there's a lot of emotional conflict to begin with is because there are a lot of like unmet expectations, a lot of emotional burden or labor that individual has to take at one side of the end of the relationship, right? But when it's communicated, when it's clearly outlined, when there's a cost-benefit analysis you're doing going into the relationship, it's more transparent, which is to say the communication is more direct and unlikely to lead to a lot of conflict, right? Because when you're making this communication transparent and direct, there's probably going to be some surface levels of tension that's going to exist regardless. But we tell you it's going to lead to reduce emotional conflict. At least you don't take up the emotional burden of the relationship. At least you don't go have unmet expectations for years and years to come, right? But two, it's also going to look into things like better resource allocation and communal progress. How does that mean? Look, your time, energy, money are all emotional investments, are all investments that you make into a relationship. In status quo, you never get the return of that. What happens is that you're constantly frustrated when an individual is not going up to your expectation, when your boyfriend is probably not taking you to fancy restaurants, even if you are putting a lot of emotional labor to make that boy into a man, right? All of those things are happening in status quo right now, but people are never getting their expectations met. What happens now, or even in societal values, you are probably communal leader that put a lot of time, energy to improve your community as a whole, but your communal neighbors didn't put the same amount of effort to improve that community. Leaders taking more emotional burden than constituents. All of these things are result of emotion-based relationships. When it's a practical relationship, at least you can share or allocate communal resources better, which means that it's going to lead to more societal progress and whatnot, right? For all that reason, I want to practice.
3, 2, 1. Alright, man. Some of the Prime Minister is addressing what the government is bringing about. We get a sense of feeling that they say transparency is somehow synonymous to practicality, right? Towards the structure of my debate, I will first start with the idea of the stakeholders that we have on our end. Then I will go on to present a few arguments from our side, then a few rebuttals, and then my concluding arguments. First, to begin with, panel, let's talk about the idea that we have today, right? This house prefers a world where all relationships are pursued on the basis of practicality, where practicality is your metric. Now, how do you define practicality, panel? Decisions which are primarily based on efficiency and utility and productivity is what you call as practicality. Now, what do these relationships include, right? The Prime Minister came up and said everything, including familial, community, professional, etc., right? When your stakeholders here include your individuals, your families, your societies, and the future generation. Now, how do you significantly identify the debate, right? When you're talking about human beings at large, they go beyond practicality in every single counter instance. Let's talk about simple relationships, like parents and child, like the Prime Minister brought about, right? With a simple argument, saying that growing up as a child, you have your values, and there's a clear cost-benefit analysis. You speak about it transparently, right? But that's not how it works in an ideal world. Let's take a simple example. You are a parent who has just had a child, and the child happens to be a person with disability, right? Now, on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, you are never going to raise the child and abandon the child, because on the simple basis of why the child is disabled, it's not practical to raise the child, or simply the costs outweigh the benefits in this case. Let's talk another example, right? Now, practicality as an identity breeds isolation, and it invites transactionalism. But what do I mean by that, right? It's a simple utilitarian idea, and is the fact that let's take this example of slavery, right? Slavery was seen as practical because rich people can afford slaves at their houses and they can take labor out of it, right? It's a simple utilitarian idea which is completely practical. Why? Because it is primarily based on efficiency and utility, like the government side brings here. And let's talk about how it is more viable in an economic context, right? When you see it at large, it might seem seemingly large and okay in a macroeconomic context. but you should always look at the microeconomic, micro-social context, right? Because when you talk about human beings in relationship, it happens at a micro level, on a person-to-person basis. Because today I sit here with the debates with these two people, not just because they are good debaters, also because they are my friends, right? Because here the Prime Minister comes and says that, hey, I'm friends with Hazim because I want to become a better student. What if Hazim is not a good debater? She will never be friends with him anymore. Like, Hazim, I'm so sorry for you, mate. But if you talk about practicality at the end, it is also based on friendships and other transactions that you do on a normal level, right? You will only be friends with someone if you had a good LinkedIn profile. So you better have a good LinkedIn profile, right? Otherwise, you're not even friends anymore in the college. What happens? You're isolated. You breed individualism. You sit in the back bench, you study as a topper, you don't talk to the person who sits in the front, right? Because that person simply happens to be of, say, a lower class or from a lower society or an economic angle. Because the person does not have money. Because practically, if I want to go out and sit in Starbucks and have like 300 iron worth of coffee and whatever, whatnot, I would want to do that because it's practical for me to carry that person in a Mercedes Benz along with me. The other person would just drive a cycle, right? Better get a Mercedes for me. Now, if you talk about gig economy, let's talk about economy in general, right? Because that's an important parameter of how society works. If you talk about gig economy, let's take examples like Food Panda or Grab. These people will just be simple disposable tools. They will lose their professional identity and they will simply be socially excluded and isolated because they will be mere elements in society which is catering to one specific need of yours. Essentially will not have any value of a relationship anymore because that is based on simple human emotions, and that is the metric that we have to view, panel, and that is our burden to prove today, and which is exactly why I say that the bedrock of relationships is emotional relationship. By emotional relationship, you should talk about the primary function, right? The primary function is social mobility, and social mobility starts when you go beyond practicality, when you start viewing the human for who they are, right? And societies and major movements in this society has started out of love and started out of this very specific idea of love. Say suppose I want to marry somebody from a lower caste or from a poor economic background, right? It is not practically viable for me. But I do that out of my own will and wish because I love that person. It comes from my heart, right? I do that on the basis of creating that economic relationships. And that, when you view at a micro level, causes social mobility. Today, I decide to move somebody on the basis of, approach somebody on the basis of the fact that I love that person. I move in, right? Because I do inter-caste marriages or suppose even inter-religious marriages at the end of the day. Because you view that person for who they are and not because of anything else. Pure, quick, you have 10 seconds.
Yes, indeed. Don't you think that different set of fellows will create tension between two extreme portions of society where you have rich and poor people dating?
Brilliant question, right? Let's take the simple example of Nazi Germany, right? It was very practical for me to put Jews in concentration camps and kill them because very two vast different population sizes, right? Because I did not believe in human relationships. I believe in practicality because I wanted to rule the country. Do you think we should bring them back? It's a very simple example, right? To answer your question. Let's talk about even mental health crisis at the end of the day. Let's talk about how work cultures happen today, right? Today people want to shut down. The idea of ghosting in itself, in practical terms, right? You want to shut down from society. You don't want to talk to somebody after hearing that they are not practical, not utilitarian. The amount of mental health crisis that causes, right? You talk about happiness index in the world, right? You talk about the way that your country is not happy. When do you say your country is not happy? Even on global terms, in economic terms, only when your micro relationships are affected. And that is the fundamental unit of the debate that we're talking today, panel, and which is exactly why this side of the house opposes the fact that practicality can never be a basis in a world where all relationships are defined. And very clearly, right, from that end of the house, we have this very clear argument that, okay, communication and transparency, I will communicate it clearly to you and then I will enter into what kind of relationships. If communication and transparency were to become the key aspect, right, you will transparently say that I'm a racist and walk away. And that is exactly what is going to happen. And time is a finite resource. Beautiful, right? That is exactly why you should forge brilliant human relationships because you want to take human relationships forward. And it is not just grounded in financial benefits and personal growth. They say that personal growth as an individual comes from the fact of practicality, but from our side of the house, we say it is not. Because the idea of personal growth as an individual comes with cultural cohesiveness. It happens when you speak to another person, even when it is impractical, even when you forge a relationship with somebody which is impractical. That grows you as a person. It puts you to different ideas and approaches that you take towards society. You learn new things. You change yourself as an individual and you change your family as an individual, right? And that is exactly how brilliant social movements and social mobility is happening forward. And the bedrock of that is exactly the relationship. If if it were to be practical, in an elderly society, we would throw our parents away, right? Because it's very simply, in the cost-benefit analysis angle, it is not okay to have your parents at home when they're old, right? Because it's inconvenient. You better live with your family, right? And that is exactly from this end of the house. We believe that all relationships should not be pursued on the basis of practicality, and exactly why we take this debate.
One major call out to opposition's entire case, right? I think they fail to acknowledge that relationships are a choice. They're a two-way street. That means that they're all their uncharitable arguments regarding oppression and stuff. First of all, fails because oppression is a one-way relationship. You're just projecting your power. That is not even a relationship, I would argue. But second, two major call outs in two major rebuttals in this regard. Firstly, in regards to how they mentioned that in regards to their whole oppression argument, I think practically speaking, oppression ended in South Africa because it was no longer efficient. Because spending that level of money was just not going to happen. That's the main reason. It also happened in Nazism as well. It was just expensive. They couldn't keep it up. And this is why it ended. This is why practicality and avoiding these kinds of relationships already happens on our side. Two pieces of rebuttal in this regard. Firstly, in regards to the whole addressing the POI, in regards to suddenly you won't be fighting for your love or you won't be doing that. First, this is not true because you won't get into relationships that aren't aligned with you in the first place. So if you don't love that person or if you don't find that person to be an efficient relationship, you just won't get into that relationship in the first place. Secondly, engaging on an even if you don't you do get into that relationship, you don't extend an inefficient relationship, which I would already argue is a benefit on our side. Because just extending that longer prevents you from being in a relationship that actually works for you, and also just creates a lot of emotional as well as physical burden when it comes to just staying in an unhealthy, ineffective relationship. Second thing then is in regards to how suddenly people from lower socioeconomic status won't get into relationships or they will be abandoned. Dude, there are other people who face the same criteria too. There are other people from low socioeconomic status that they can get into relationships with, which I would argue are more effective. I'll take you later. Which I would argue are more effective because they have shared struggles that already overcomes one of the main barriers they might face in regards to conflict in their relationship, which creates a better kind of relationships on our side in the first place. Two pieces of two arguments within the debate. Firstly, in regards to why even if, and this is adding to Arwa's argument, even if the expectations or the practicality is set by your family and not by you, it's going to be principally justified for you to follow through with it. Two things then. Firstly, in regards to how it creates an existence of a standard that you can follow. Why does this standard exist? First, it's because your family probably knows you deeply and cares about you. So that means that the practical standards that they're going to be setting for you are already going to be to your benefit and going to accommodate for that relationship to be a better relationship in the first place. Secondly, is because it acts as a form of protection in the first place. Human beings are just inherently want to protect themselves anyway. So that means that if you're getting into a relationship that is based on certain standards, you're more likely to avoid unsuccessful relationships that might lead you to an emotional turmoil or make you feel worse about yourself that is going to harm your relationship. But secondly, in regards to how you are more likely to avoid abusive relationships that are more likely to harm you physically, because prior to that, you're able to set the standard in regards to your values, you're able to set the standard when it comes to literally creating the clear standard Arwa talks to you about. Because the end goal then is in regards to something that you can literally find through the first conversation. Do you want to be in a fling relationship or a marriage relationship? That already solves relationships that break up, for example, because they have different ideas as to what the end goal of that relationship is. You're no longer stuck into that emotional harm because you're able to get out of that relationship and find the person that aligns with your values then. Third thing then, in regards to how it helps individuals who are lost on how to pursue relationships. That means individuals who aren't really taught the standards to expect, who go into the world expecting romance to be hopeless romantics on television and get into abusive relationships because he was able to flirt really well from the get-go, are no longer going to get into these relationships because they know the standard that their family holds for them. They know the standard as to why to weigh themselves with the people they're getting into a relationship with and know that they have shared political values or religious values or just as human beings in general, they share similar ideologies. Second thing then, as to why even if it leads to the elitism they talk and try to push to us, it's still okay. First is because your family probably worked really hard to create that wealth in the first place. I think it's principally justified that they're able to control that within their systems. Second thing then is in regards to how you probably care about your family. That means that one, you prioritize similar values and you are going to be putting them into consideration. Second is in regards to how it protects you from being harmed emotionally as a low social economic person as well. Because you're no longer going to be emotionally harmed by that individual, by the family of the individual you love. That means if I'm poor and I went to a relationship with a really rich guy, I'm more likely to be able to get emotionally abused by his family, more likely to be paid off by his mom to get out of that relationship in the first place. That happens on their side when you're pushed by emotions. That doesn't happen on our side, and why we're better. But before then, you're POI.
Social mobility happens, especially when we integrate. Now, your version of this model suggests that every individuals from the same communities will come together. Do you not suggest that this pursues and propagates inequality?
I don't think this is fair for you to push, because I don't understand why the most important metric in today's debate is in regards to social mobility in the first place. I don't think this is what the motion is about. But even if it is, Hazim will tackle that later. Thirdly, in regards to how it creates less conflict among family members. That means that if I'm an individual who has grown up with a certain group of people who have certain values, I'm more likely to have similar ideologies, right? So that means that if I'm able to get with someone who shares these values in the first place, who's able to have this shared identity, it's going to be conflict resolution becomes easier on our side. What impact does this create? Twofold. Firstly, in regards to economic and career trajectory. Because, for example, if I was in a relationship with my trainer, for example, and I was to have an argument with him, I'm no longer going to end my relationship in regards to him training me, because I'm not looking at it emotionally. I'm going to look at the benefits he's able to provide me. He's going to look at the benefit I'm able to provide him in regards to improving his career trajectory. That's better on our side. Secondly, in regards to the vulnerability and the protection of individuals who are in abusive relationships, who are in vulnerable situations, something they did not engage with, a very strong push coming from Arwa, I don't understand how they can win this debate. So if you're weighing between the idea of social mobility, which I don't understand why it's relevant in the first place, I don't think they proved it sufficiently on their side, and in regards to the vulnerability and the career trajectory that happens on our side, I think we already win this debate. For all those reasons, proud to propose it.
The government can take the debate in one possible contingency. That is the contingency that this debate was an actor-based debate where the actor was born into a rich family, had high social standards, was born into the majority religion and born into a royal family which had extremely rich wealth, right? But that is not the debate that we're looking at. When we say that this house prefers as a society, this house prefers as a country, this house prefers as successful people, that is, we think about the social order at large as to what the benefit from the status quo where emotional and practical matters govern social relationship, or individual has the choice to make those social relationship. Why would the society prefer one mode of choosing relationships over the other that will create a possible social function that will improve the society as a large? That is exactly what the outcome of this debate should be. That is the burden of the debate that is on their side. Obviously, okay, if I'm born into a rich family, right? If I'm obviously on the elitist of the circles, and if I'm possibly wanting to create a cult, government can definitely take a debate, and I would love them for it. But that is not what we're debating here at the end of the day. So the construction of the motion is very narrow in sense of an interpretation. Probably out of the 1 million stakeholders, they cover 1% of the population. The remaining 99% of the population is covered by our house debate, right? Firstly, on their idea of that relationship is a two-way street and operations won't exist because of this. And secondly, people will still have they had a brilliant argument saying a person who is socio-economically marginalized will also have socio-economically marginalized friends. This is the backest argument I heard in the whole debate. So what you're practically telling that operation won't exist here is that you create a cult, that people from the elitist circles will be friends with elitist circles, people from the lower status of the society will be friends with people from the lower status of the society. So what practically happens here is clear social division in terms of social relations. When there are no social relations that is formed across the intersectionality, which can possibly happen through emotional vulnerability and emotional opening and emotional aspects of being the metrics of deciding a relationship or personhood, what practically happens here is that you create a cult where the hierarchical social order is set. This bans social mobility. Obviously, when such a hierarchical social order is set, all my interactions happen are within my circles. This is obviously going to strengthen the oppressive circles and weaken the oppressed circles. This is exactly how oppression happens. Secondly, they say that elitism, if it is being elitist from our side of the house is okay because my dad probably worked hard to get into this position, right? My dad probably had to walk 5 kilometers to probably get his high school degree. Your dad was born in a silver spoon and sent into Oxford by paying $1 million. They not like us, right? We are exactly not the same when it comes to this phenomenon. The idea of socio-economic status built by generational wealth is something that is pre-existing across the world. People from the first world countries obviously have better opportunities and obviously have better exposure than people from the global south, right? This practically dismantles the whole idea by telling that all the wealth generated was just because of pure hard work. It is also because of generational wealth. It is also because of colonial plundering and other factors like that. Further, when they come and tell that, in the world of practicality, people will evaluate their relationship or pursue their relationship through metrics, which are family standards, social standards, religion, and financial. What practically happens here is that they ban social mobility because they want to keep their status quo. If you're going to make friends, relationship, and all your bonds within your status quo, this is something that is going to fixate the social hierarchical order, and there won't be any social mobility. And next they say that individuals, then the beautiful example which Ashik tormented them came up on saying that, I'm going to be friends with Hazim because he has a great academic record. So what happens to Hazim now, right? So now when he comes to give a speech, or now next time when he goes to give an exam, he'll constantly be thinking, oh, if the judge scores me less than 77, or if I don't get a great score, she's not going to be friends with me anymore. I'm going to lose friends. So let's say for example, tomorrow I had a breakup. I opened up to my friend, right? And that friend is there for me with my academic record. Tomorrow I fail in an exam, yeah, I've already lost a partner. Second, I'm already losing a friend because my academic record is bad. So what practically happens is that it puts a severe emotional burden or stress on the individual or on every individual to keep up with their practical realities, which is always not possible, or else they are going to lose their emotional support circle. This is a very Gen Z argument that they made throughout the debate, where they said that, oh, individual scores matter more, I need to have friends. Today I have 1 million followers, somebody's friends with me. Tomorrow Instagram takes my account, nobody cares about me anymore, right? So the whole idea of emotional vulnerability is something that is ignored throughout the part of their house. And finally they come and tell that, your practicalities are dynamic, they're set in stone when you enter into the relationship. When they're not met, you step out of the relationship. And the stupid example that was given was that if in a relationship of 10 years, if somebody is not financially stable for 2 years, I'll still stay because that's practical. No, that is not practical because in 2 years you could run into bankruptcy, right? 2 out of 10 years if you run into bankruptcy, you won't be able to make your ends meet. And in that case, what practically happens is that even that person, the other person's relationship will constantly be under that pressure to maintain that same social standards, or else their whole relationship barrier fails because all of them are based on realities, numericals and stuff like that. So with that, I would like to further narrativize practicality here is that practicality might not work in individual personal relationship or an individual social relationship, unlike macro social relationship. Macro social relationship, like let's say for example, if you increase fines, the amount of traffic violations will reduce because you're governing the social society as a whole. But in interpersonal relationships which are greatly personal, where they're value driven, where they're idealistic, where your grow-ups matter and there are a lot of emotional reliance on the other person, they are largely unpredictable. Human behavior is extremely unpredictable. And practicality is grounded in realism, which means predicting the future for a particular outcome, right? When the whole idea of human behavior is fundamentally unpredictable, basing your whole argument on that basis is something that is going to be deeply problematic. With that being said, it is going to alter the basis of relationship. Relationships are built on the strong bedrock of being socially stable, and this bedrock is something that is built on emotion. So what happens here is when you take these emotional factors out of the picture, or when you tell that the threshold of the metrics that I am suggesting is going to be more important than the aspects that I am bringing in the emotional side, your relationship's bedrock become weaker in nature. So this reduces the social value that relationship have. This is probably going to increase your divorce rate. This is going to create a lack of brotherhood, and this is going to increase communal tensions. So the bedrock of relationship, which is solidified, which is a social glue, which is emotion, is something being overpowered inside government by practicality, which as we established are not always predictable in nature. Secondly, practicality is context-driven, it is a context-driven concept. So the idea of practicality being pushed for different people. What might be practical for me in one relationship might not be practical for me in another relationship because of the emotional bond I share with different sets of people. What I'm okay with doing with you will not be the same what I'm okay with doing with someone else. That is practically because my emotional bond or the level of connect I have with different people is different. So there is no solidified metric that you can have for practicality in this given place. And further, the whole idea of social change was something that was put by Ashik as to how the idea of emotional connect can melt social change. Let's say for example, if you are Nazi Germany, if you're part of the majority, you would have housed a Jew in your house so that they are not sent into concentration camps. Why would you do that? Because you're emotionally connected to them. Is it practical for you to do that? Absolutely fucking no, because the government is going to come and torment you. With that being said, one last argument that I would possibly want to extend is that art is not something that can be extended in the world of practicality at all, because the whole idea of art is to bend, blend and extend practicality, or is against practicality at the end of nature. With this, proud talk.
Now, the flaw with opposition side's argument is because they fail to really understand the nuances of the motion. First, let us reread the motion. It says this house prefers a world where all relationships are pursued on the matters of practicality. There's two matters of precision here you need to know. Firstly, it talks about all relationships in general, and it talks about how it's a relationship panel. It does not mean that all forms of economic or any social interactions are included under that function. It's when you have an option or your own choice of benefit to pursue somebody that you want to interact with of your own accord. It doesn't mean that you won't interact with your boss at work. It doesn't mean you won't interact with your food delivery driver or the person who drives your taxi. All these interactions in society still exist. The debate then is about who would you want to pursue as a person in a relationship, whether it's your best friend or your partner in a marriage, so on and so forth. So under that metric panel, all the harms that opposition's trying to posit, which is now you're going to create major elitism, where you're going to create people who are locked out, you're going to create echo chambers, do not exist because these other social interactions exist. But let's debate on that metric. Let's show you how it's still winnable on our side. The second thing on matter of precision I want to point out, panel, is when they tell you or they try to expand to you the fact that elitism and the practicality of oppression exists. Notice how we're trying to talk about your incentives to pick a relationship. All the matter we give you on our side is trying to prevent harms that they never engage with. We've told you about how emotional pressures exist. In status quo, right, panel, opposition never claims to you, never proves to you substantively where a lower socio-economic standard person or individual, for example a poor person, can now freely interact with those from the rich or the elite mindset. In status quo, this doesn't happen. And even if it does happen, what's going to end up happening are threefold. Firstly, you find this person from a lower socio-economic standard feeling pressure to live the lifestyle. They cannot afford a Starbucks all the time. They cannot go out all the time to fancy cafes. And they now feel this sense of fear of left out for that purpose. But even then, let's say you do get into this and this person is kind enough to let you in those circles and pay for everything. You then have another layer, which is your familial standards, the socio-economic standards. This particular person's friend from that metric or that kind of side of the world will not immediately accept you into their circle. They will not be very inviting because of the standards they create. This now creates a tension between these things, and this is going to harm further relationships moving forward. The more important thing and the better thing to go when you're at that standard level, right, panel, is to look for people who are more practical in that sense. And that's why Subi's entire argument is very important. She's not saying that when you look at it with a logical lens, you only take away emotion. It's a more black and white. It's a 0-to-1 ratio, right, panel? It looks like emotions can take into account. It looks like values. That's what she said in her setting up. With a moment in time when you're able to look at the person's values, how they treat other people, the socioeconomic standards, how families play a major role into how you interact with other individuals, is when you can A, pick the particular person who suits your style and suits your interests and incentives as a person in society as a whole, and B, you now stave away the emotional burden or gaslighting that is more likely going to happen when you marry from different classes, which is a high likelihood. But even then, let's put that out the window. Let's prove to you why without these extreme harms, we're still better on our side. Two things. Firstly, let's talk about who creates a more beneficial relationship in the long run. We talk about two things here, panel, on side government. Firstly, you have shared struggles when you're from the same emotional background, or when you look at things practicality. When you look at things from a view or a lens of practicality, when you look at same values, you immediately find out A, who has the ability to go through your life at a similar value, when you have gone through the same struggles, when you relate to this person, when you've gone through similar scenarios in life, when you can support one another through them. This doesn't necessarily happen when you don't look at it through practical lenses. When you look at a person from a more objectified lenses and through glass or rosy tinted glasses. When you don't see this person for who they are and you look at this person from an objectified person, you now negate any ability to think rationally how this person is going to help me in my future, whether or not he's going to abuse me. These are the things that are going to happen on their side when you don't look at these aspects, when you don't look at the practical aspects and you only judge them, because then you will have problems like, oh, I can fix this person, right? Let's say it's a heavy smoker or an abusive person. Oh, I can fix this person in the long run. Let me still fight for this love without looking at the inherent harms that are going to happen to you as throughout the relationship progresses. Secondly, then, let's break down the argument of social mobility right now. They claim to you that more integration will happen on the other side when you don't look at it practically, when you take it at an emotional level. Three things wrong with this. Firstly, it's not a fair metric right now. You cannot then impose on us that social mobility will never happen given the fact that society doesn't come to a standstill. You still have interaction, you still go to the bank for God's sake, you still go to work, you still have other schools or universities. By God's sake, I'm very sure that people within this room itself are from different social backgrounds and they give it. But we choose to pick people based on who we're practical with and we're happier that way. But secondly then, let's have it at a different standpoint, right? Let's talk about how social mobility does not create the more advanced integration that we claim. On our side, the moment you're able to look at more practical outcomes, you're able to pick and choose who from these different social classes you are able to conform with and you're able to talk to without feeling the bad of it. You now are able to judge who are the bad rich people and who are the worst rich people on their inside. On their side, they don't get to that because they choose to have a rosy version of the world where they only look at the people from a more emotional standpoint. Sure, maybe we will trade off that, yeah, you get a more genuine and pure version of love. However, that is inherently washed out given the large amount of harms you're going to have when these people don't fit in together. But sure, let's take a pure ride.
Interactions are cute. I go to a bank or to a person from a different social capability about what my check number is, where my amount is going to credit from, say thank you and come back. Where is social mobility?
At the end of the day, you're still interacting with people, you're still having discussions, you still have group projects, you still have jobs or HRs you have to resolve to. The key of this debate and how you weigh this as a metric right now is which side provides you the avenues and the capacity to judge a relationship for which is more beneficial on your side. Given the fact that Subi has already set up the debate, how time is a finite resource, how your resources, your money, so on and so forth are finite, and you're trying to be able not to be the most oppressed on our world. As much as opposition side tries to argue that oppression is going to happen more on our side, we tell you, the moment you're able to rationally think and logically think of, is this person going to use me, or is this person going to left me alone or not judge me for based on who I am as a person, is going to have more abuses on their side. The moment in time you have individuals who do not look at the relationship as a more practical standard, they only look at it as a one-tinted emotional standard just for the purpose of purity. You lack the ability to notice the harms of the relationship. You lack the ability for people to now come out of the relationship and have the choice now to go out rather than sticking in and trying to fight for something that's already failing. For these reasons, you need to weigh the debate on which side allows you to create more beneficial relationships in the long run and which side protects these people from having abusive relationships. For those reasons, both sides cover.
Panel, I understand that usually in a debate we're supposed to be the devil's advocate, but we're not supposed to be the devil himself. Now the point that I'm making with this is on their end, and the burden on them primarily, is to prove why pursuing practicality as the primary metric creates a better society at large. Our end, or our burden, is only to prove that it should not be the only or the sole determinant factor. Now, in our end of the model, and as status quo exists at present today, practicality is not something that is not considered at all. It is in fact considered. It's just not the only sole determinant. Why is that better? Because we also weigh it in contrast with emotional needs, with actual bonds that people share through social interactions propagated. Now this debate has come down to three primary clashes. One, of emotional versus practicality. Second, that relationships are a choice. And finally, the point of social mobility. I'll start with that of relationships are a choice. Now, the government today has created the stakeholder scheme that every relationship is also covered in this definition, meaning parents, friends, any familial bonds are also covered. Since when can you choose who your family is? Since when is there a choice in the fact that my father might be a bigot, my father might be homophobic, and how do I let that man then make the determination of who I will finally marry? Now they've made this point, your family knows you best, your family knows your values. How are they making a decision based on what I want to marry? How is my family going to know me well enough at all? In fact that the world has globalized has given us a platform today to come and meet people from different social interactions and let our values change. Had we never had this point, had we never had those interpersonal conflicts that lead us to think about why our values aren't practical, why our values are not the only ones that should be believed, we would never, as society, have evolved. We would never have left racism. Also, they also make this one bold claim, which is not related to the debate technically, but I still want to address it, that oppression, and I quote, ended in South Africa because of efficiency. I want to remind you, oppression in South Africa has not ended. it is still very prevalent. Racism is also very, very prevalent. And the only times people necessarily want to come forward and actually engage with determinants of social oppression are when you care about the person who is being oppressed. My father today cares about feminism because he has a daughter. He would not have cared, he would not have had the option to actually think about the fact that this is something that could oppress another community. So relationships necessarily are not a choice, and in those interactions where your parents are involved, you cannot necessarily make a determination on practicality. Why? My father might fall sick today, he might get cancer. I am a student, I am broke. Doesn't practically make sense for me to be associated with him. Or secondly, the example they have necessarily raised is that you will have a transparency in your familial relationship where you will let your parents know the kind of financial support you expect from them. That simply makes no sense. For example, I love my parents because they're my parents, not because they add a tangible benefit to my life. That is the most selfish way of looking at a relationship at any point of time. Which brings me back to my starting line. Be the devil's advocate, not the devil himself. Now, the second point that they make is on the terms of how certain people from marginalized community will also find relationship and love in people of the same marginalized community. What the fuck, man? I don't get to interact with someone simply because it's not practical or my family doesn't believe in it. I am the product of an impractical marriage. My parents were intercaste. They were not being supported by society. I exist today because love existed, because emotions existed. My mother fell sick. My father could have left at any point of time. But they did not, and they have 20 years of marriage. Why? Because practicality was not the core determining factor. Social cohesion, any form of metric that exists to actually build society from scratch, and what separates us from animals, by the way, because elephants do leave their old when they're too old, is the fact that we base our relationships on emotions, on love, on respect, and not just on practicality, not just on benefits. An example raised was that my trainer and I might fight, and we might be in a relationship, but I will not leave them because of the benefit they add to my life. Do you realize the foundational flaw in this is that any partner I ever have will leave me the moment I don't attach practicality to them anymore? What does this create on my point? It creates an insecure partner because they necessarily know that they can never actually trust my partner to be with me for me, because they're necessarily with me for factors that are not intrinsic to me as a person, because I am the practical choice. Now, coming to the next point they make on social mobility and why it is necessarily irrelevant. I don't quite understand this, and it was sufficiently addressed by the DLO in the fact that the motion is one which is catering to society as a large. Therefore, aims of the society have to properly be looked at. Yes?
Anu already mentioned in the beginning of her speech that emotion is considered in practicality. Why do you guys get to hijack practicality but we don't get any emotional results?
Because you're not making a good debate, you're not making the point of practical emotion, but still engaging with your debate. They've also made the point that practicality is dynamic on their end, and this is where they're also conceding that emotional impact is necessary. But they also make the point of how if you've been with someone for 10 years and then for 2 years it's not practical, necessarily don't understand the point, because as DLO had also mentioned that it is impractical if you go into bankruptcy, but also the fact that the stakeholders in this debate must be considered as not just romantic interactions. In fact, that is what is squirrel promotion, where almost every example made has been on the basis of who is the practical choice for marriage, even though they have admitted the fact that stakeholders are not limited to just marriage. But regardless of it, if I look at the fact that practicality being the determinant on a long-term relationship would necessarily further the rate of divorce in society, would necessarily lead to a breakdown of bonds. Now, I have a child with a man who I don't practically always agree with, but I stay with them for the emotional need of the fact that I actually have a child with them that I need to raise in an emotionally fulfilling manner. Now, this begs the obvious question, which they have also raised, about that of abuse. But I have one final question to ask. You marry your father's choice. How do you know that person's not abusive to you? They're practical to you on the lens that they match your social cohesiveness, they match the fact that they're as rich as you, they're from the same caste, same religion, all the metrics, they have the same values as your parents do. But they don't have the same values as you, but practically your family knows you best, and therefore any determinant they make will necessarily be the best choice. And so therefore, on those three fronts, which is the emotional versus practical, where on our end of this side we say that yes, practicality is a determinant, but not the sole determinant for us. On the second point, that the burden on them is to prove that their metric is necessarily better than status quo as it exists today. Status quo that in fact furthers social mobility, that engages and encourages people to fall in love regardless of whether it is practical or not. And a simple example is, it is not practical to be a gay person in a conservative country, but people like that still exist. It is not practical. Does that deprive them of their right to fall in love? And finally, that relationships are a choice. Relationships are necessarily not a choice, especially in the widest scope of stakeholders they make. The only relationship of choice that they are necessarily engaged with is that of friendships or that of marriage. But the final or the more And friendship and marriage is again something that not everybody gets to experience in their lives, by the way. But what everybody does get to experience is familial ties. And those relationships are not of choice. Those relationships cannot just be based on practicality. And with that, we take the debate.
Alright, man. Before I even begin, right, it's a simple thing that till the end of the first constructive part of this debate, the first 4 speeches, the government brought in an actor-based debate and kept on going when we ran a completely larger social-based debate analyzing all stakeholders, right? Now, let me start with a very simple context. If I go outside of this room today, on the basis of whatever was spoken in this debate, on the basis of the stakeholders which involve individuals, and we're also talking about personal relationships, say my team speaks the same language as I do, and they don't, I still walk in and talk to them, forging a meaningful relationship and a connection because I want to grow as an individual, not just because they're good debaters or bad debaters, right? And that is fundamentally what we're talking about today. And even when you speak about stakeholder analysis at the end of the day, their entire argument, when they keep saying the idea of similar values, identity, and ideologies are practical, they never really mechanize it, right? The best example that they gave was the fact that there's 3 generations of wealth with me, and I come in with that, why would I talk to somebody else? Because it is impractical for me. And that contextualizes their entire debate. And we simply say that that doesn't work, as Ovipsha and Ariv pointed out. Because you forge social mobility, you speak about the idea of human relationships only when you engage with people outside of your comfort zone. When you talk to people not because it's practical, but you do that out of creating human connections, right? Let's take a simple example of long-term relationships which are spoken about on both sides of the debate. When you weigh the both and you see what value is best, you value the idea of stability and long-term relationships on our side of the house more because of the fact that you derive connections out of meaningful trust and relationship which you don't remove out of any other factor, right? Because let's take an example of quick betrayals, right? Like how startup founders, even in economic support, once you're down losing on a C value funding, you're out of the entire context because you don't want to stand with that person anymore and support them. Or simple aspects, say international relations, where collaborative alliances will happen in a treaty because you don't want to arrive meaningful relationships out of it, right? And that's the core of the argument that we're speaking about. And in fact, when Ovipsha was questioned on a POI, saying that practicality was also included on our side of the house when you're talking about emotions which come together, and Ovipsha said that they never really addressed it, which is exactly the case. Because one aspect when they came in and said, with respect to the fact that practicality includes emotions, was to the extent that the threshold changes when practicality takes a head above emotions, right? And that they came speaking about social interactions, which was throughout their debate. And their idea was that on our side of the house, we do have social interactions. If you can speak to the food panda guy, and it doesn't matter, right? But social interactions does not equal to human relationships because social interactions are simply on the basis of utility or practical value. You just speak to them and you go out. I'll give you a better example. If tomorrow I want to take that food panda guy out for a date, I will never be able to do that, right? Or if I want to buy him a cup of coffee and sit with him at a coffee shop, I will never be able to do that. And I will never be able to have the aspect of loyalty, right? Because loyalty is thrown out of the window on their side of the house. Because you will never have loyalty because it's simply based on pragmatic mathematical calculations. What to do in my life at the end of the day, right? On that side of the debate, we win again too. Because that is the fundamental unit of how social economic relationships work at the end of the day. Ariv, I and Ovipsha, all of us came and told you how even on a microeconomic level, which is how you fundamentally value society, all of these core arguments make a lot of sense. The idea of trust, the idea of loyalty, the idea of staying longer in a relationship, the idea of waiting for somebody even in their bad times, because it's not practical, because it's not utilitarian, because you do that out of love, you do that out of human connections, and that is how you forge a relationship. Right? And that is exactly how your relationships will be pursued. When you go back to the motion again panel, this house again, they want to prefer a world in which relationships are pursued only on the basis of practicality, which is exactly why we oppose. Because on weighing both sides, it is very clear to us that our side of the house does not support the argument, where we do not put the threshold of practicality above the idea of emotions and human relationships, and that is exactly where the panel should weigh this debate on. And we take that debate on all counts because the idea of values, the idea of identity, the idea of ideologies, which they keep speaking about, even with respect to conditional support or economic relationships, are weighed better on our side of the bargain because practicality inherently exists in this world. We are just trying to put the threshold of emotional relationships above the idea of practicality, and that is exactly where we take this debate panel, and I'm very, very proud of it.
Starting my speech in 3. I really love how the entire time can hijack all our benefits but never actually give benefits to your case, right? First call out, don't give new matter from third speaker and reply please. Firstly, understand that their whole case can be just broken down into two ideas, right? That one, emotions, individuals are unpredictable, therefore practicality doesn't really work. But two, it somehow leads to a lot of social oppressions and no social mobility, right? Number one, on the idea of social mobility, I don't understand why social mobility is only accessible to relationships, whereby the most popular forms of social mobility is not relationships, but therefore other forms of social mobility, like going to the university, trying to be better as an individual, right? But two, they try to hijack our benefits of individual improvement through emotional pain, where my first minute of my speech was how I probably want to be friends, not just because of the economical benefit it derives, but of the personal growth and emotional growth that it derives from, right? I don't understand how they can even ignore that idea to begin with. From the very part of my speech, I didn't tell you that practicality was economical and utility based as well. Practicality doesn't mean that you get money and therefore it's a better relationship. Practicality means on all the XYZ values I mentioned in my speech. It also means if an emotion is impractical to pursue, you're not going to do it. If an emotion is practical to pursue, you're going to pursue it. That's the whole idea of practicality. It just means convenience and therefore what is best to protect yourself, as Raghad said to begin with, right? But two, the debate then, what it looks like is what is a better approach to relationship. It is if practicality should take precedence or emotion should be precedence. I told you, there are little conflicts happening in the world right now in status quo that they never tell you how they actually solve. They never tell you how they solve emotional conflict. They just don't want to simply gut check their arguments, right? They just don't want to sound elitist, and they want to say, oh, it's better to have intercaste marriage because it's going to lead to social cohesion. But at least 90% of the intercaste marriages and interforms of this suffer from emotional toll because of societal pressure. You're always gonna be emotionally abused by that particular family. You literally admitted when you said your parents were never supported by the social world. Was that emotional toll ever acknowledged? The point is that when you pursue a relationship based on emotion only or emotion taking precedence, you suffer from extreme emotional toll, which I told you that leads to emotional conflict. By the way, emotional conflict literally led to wars and things happening in the world right now, right? People suffer from emotional conflict minutes a day. There's no benefit in the world right now, or there's no resolution in the world right now that allows you to solve this emotional benefit. I think it's better to be a bit lonely as a fuckboy rather than having emotional conflict given to you every time of the day because you chose an inconvenient, impractical relationship to begin with. That was never addressed by them to begin with. But tell you, they think that social interactions are not going to exist. The point of social interaction is not to always pursue relationships, but it doesn't mean you're going to be shitty asshole to your food panda driver. That doesn't exist. They take human beings at the most extreme animalistic pursuit. We told you that's not going to happen. Human beings are going to have rational calculus, meaning I'm not going to be the shitty to my friend who's a little poorer than me. I'm not going to be shitty to the friend who comes from a low social economy. It just means maybe I don't want to pursue the most best friendship that I exist. But two, if it's more practical to me to be friends with that poorer person, then I'm probably gonna be pursuing that relationship. I already told you first minute of my speech that this kind of practicality depends on an individual calculus. People are not gonna be, all people in the world are not racist motherfuckers, right? But on the idea of oppression, we already told you moral guilt is also impractical to begin with. Meaning that if you have things like you're being oppressive to someone and you have that suffering from moral guilt, you're probably not going to do that oppression to begin with. But regardless, in your world, people are still racist. Acknowledge how you solve that problem. People still do oppression. Acknowledge how you solve that problem by making it an emotion-based relationship. What happens is that we at least try to protect the most vulnerable people from taking the emotional burden of relationships in the status quo. They never give you resolution for that. But two, they just try to form harms without actually giving benefit. They tell you emotions are good because it's just better to have social cohesion. Never acknowledge the harms, never acknowledge the vulnerable people going through this shit. But two, all the harms that you talk about already exist in the status quo where people already pursue relationship based on emotion. So how do you actually solve the problem? We at least try to give you a practical approach as to how people are going to change. But two, you cannot attach the harms of current status quo to our prefers world motion, where world is going to significantly change when it's going to differ in the way people approach relationships, right? We tell you, you protect the most vulnerable by making sure relationships are more transparent and people do not take the unfair emotional toll by marrying outside of their caste and being bullied to the entirety of them just because they loved a person, but never actually give you resolution about how that love leads to any form of mental peace. For all that reason,